I'm Emma. I am 32 years old, and I would want to relate a past that I have kept buried for many years because it was too painful and difficult to accept. There are some things in life that we never expect to happen, but they do, and they change everything. I never expected that I'd have to live in agony because of a truth that I still struggle to embrace. My narrative is not one of love or family happiness, as many people believe, but rather of sacrifice and buried feelings. People claim that love is the sole reason two people marry, but in the case of my mother and stepfather, I knew this was false. From the moment he appeared, I sensed something was wrong, and I eventually concluded that my mother was simply a pretext, and I was the true reason he married her. Be sure to subscribe to my channel so I can bring you more intriguing true stories like this one, and watch the video to the end because the story continues. After my father died while I was young, my mother, Amir, had a tiny, trendy store. With her tenacity and persistence, she not only saved our lives, but also transformed her fashion business into a beloved fixture in our neighborhood. My mother has always been a role model for me in terms of strength and independence. Life progressed quietly and peacefully, and she continued to work hard at the boutique while I concentrated on my studies. As time passed, I entered a transitional period in my life when I began university. It was the first time I thought I had fully departed my mother's protecting grasp and entered the larger world. The early days of university provided many new experiences, and then one day I met Mr. Mark, who was both my teacher and stepfather. Mr. Mark was a philosophy lecturer, and his teaching approach captured my attention from the first day of class. He helped me develop a deeper understanding of the subject and transformed my perspective on life. Our after-class chats got more frequent, and I realized he had a huge influence on me. Yet I gradually began to notice something odd about his stare when he looked at me. At first, I assumed it was simply my imagination. However, as time passed, this sense became clearer. When I spoke, he looked at me not only as a teacher would, but with a deeper glance, as if he knew something I didn't. That gaze contained intimacy, a stillness full of hidden messages, and I began to feel uneasy whenever it appeared. The glance that appeared to be analyzing me, as if expecting something I didn't understand, perplexed me. I wondered if I was imagining things, but the weirdness was undeniable. Not only did Mr. Mark's eyes change with time, but so did my perception of his behaviors. Every time I spoke or walked by, he would try to get closer to me, sometimes resting his hand on my shoulder in an unsettling manner. Those gestures appeared innocent at first, but they got heavier, making me uneasy when he kept me after class to discuss the lecture. But that chat was different from the others. He didn't just talk about the subject. He seemed to want to extend our meeting. That unnecessary stare and proximity made me feel claustrophobic. I no longer felt the respect and distance that professors and students should have. I gradually stopped seeing him as much as I used to. To avoid seeing him before class, I attempted to sit further away, make less eye contact, and occasionally even arrive late. I figured if I ignored Mr. Mark, everything would be great. If I didn't have to deal with those unusual glances and actions, I might be able to forget the worry that persisted throughout the school year. I attempted to avoid meeting him again. When I kept my distance, everything seemed to return to normal, and I assumed the problem was resolved. I began to wonder, but my mother simply stated that she was relieved that things were improving. Then, one afternoon, while my mother and I were sitting in the living room, she unexpectedly sat next to me. With her face bright and her eyes beaming with unbridled delight, she began to tell me something important. She had met someone special, whom she wanted to introduce to me. My heart felt lighter as I saw the enjoyment in her every gesture. For many years, my mother raised me alone, devoting all of her energy to my care. I was relieved that she had finally discovered the joy and happiness she deserved. I was quite excited when my mother planned to introduce me to that man. My mother had properly organized the house and set the supper table. I could see the pleasure and delight in her eyes, and I hoped that this man would provide her with the comfort and happiness she had been seeking for so long. When the doorbell rang, my heart raced. Mom swiftly went to open the door while I stood in the living room. When the door opened, I saw Mr. Mark, who I had imagined would join her life. An unimaginable shock flooded my heart. I stood there, unable to believe what I saw. All of my anxiety about him came back, crushing me. The man my mother adored, the man she had introduced me to with such confidence and satisfaction, was the one I had been trying to avoid all along. My mind raced with contradictory thoughts. Why him? When did they get to know each other? Did he have any intentions? The dread in my heart grew quickly, and all the memories of his strange gaze and terrible gestures returned, making it impossible for me to think clearly. I looked at my mother to see whether she realized the peculiarity of the scenario, but she was entirely unaware. She was still smiling joyfully as she introduced Mark, as if everything was normal in my heart, unknowing that Mark's presence was causing a storm in mine. Mr. Mark strolled in, smiling cheerfully. He welcomed me politely and acted shocked, stating he had not expected me to be your mother's daughter. I tried to appear astonished, but inside I was in turmoil. Although unaware of my thoughts, my mother smiled and was thrilled to learn that Mark was my teacher. The two of them chatted joyfully about this surprising coincidence while I stood there feeling a sense of who I knew him to be. Was this a coincidence? Or was there anything hidden that I couldn't see from that point forward? Everything went on as usual. There were no strange signs from Mark or anything that made me worry. Mom and he grew closer and closer, and their feelings felt very natural. I saw Mom happier than ever. She smiled often and looked radiant every day. Not long after Mom decided to remarry and Mark officially became my stepfather, everything went smoothly. Nothing unusual happened, and our family life continued to be peaceful and stable as time passed. There were no strange signs. When I saw my mother beaming brightly with Mark, I knew what was most important. She had found the happiness she deserved. Finally, I embraced their relationship and blessed them from the bottom of my heart. I hoped my mother would continue to be happy, and I learned to accept Mark as a member of our family. As time passed, I noticed no strange indicators in Mark. As I worried, I eventually hated myself for overthinking and allowing unjustified anxieties to impact me, while my mother became increasingly cheerful. Waste Mark, I was also relieved. Finally, I was thrilled for my mother and honestly wished her well, hoping that her life would always be full of joy and happiness. At the time, I assumed that things would continue in peace. It had been a long time since Mark had shown any strange behavior, and I was beginning to feel more at ease. I no longer worried or doubted my stepfather because he had always been a wonderful person, looking after my mother and our family. I honestly believed that my earlier issues sprang from my sensitivity and imagination. When I was 22, I graduated from university and began searching for my first job. Even though I hadn't found suitable employment, I chose to assist my mother at her store. We spent more time together, and Mark frequently went by the store to assist with minor things when he had free time. Everything was still going well, and I had no reservations about Mark. I honestly believed that he was a good spouse to my mother and had been a part of my life until the worst day of my life came. I was sick that day. The fever made me weary, so I couldn't go shopping with my mother as usual. She told me to stay at home and relax, and I didn't take it seriously. Only Mark did. After all those years of living together, I believed he was a wonderful, trustworthy man who cared deeply for my mother. I lay in my room, attempting to lull myself to sleep in order to forget the fever-induced discomfort and tiredness. However, that peace did not last very long. That day, in the house that I once thought was the safest place, something unexpected happened. My stepfather stayed at home with me because he didn't need to go out. At first, I didn't think anything was going to happen. I had no worries or suspicions. I didn't notice anything unusual. The medication didn't seem to take effect immediately, and I was still fully aware of my surroundings. I lay there comfortably, assuming that the fever would pass in a short period of time. However, after about 20 minutes, things began to change. Mark returned to the room, this time without medication or water. The look in his eyes scared me, but when I tried to sit up, I couldn't. I felt paralyzed, like my strength had been drained. I trembled within, trying to brace myself to escape this paralysis. But all I could do was lie there, eyes wide open, as Mark approached. Mark approached with a calm expression, but his eyes blazed with something that sent shivers down my spine. I attempted to move, but my body appeared immobilized. Not a single finger moved. He leaned down, his face just a little away from mine, and smiled, intensifying the terror of my powerlessness. His smile had become menacing and cold, rather than welcoming and gentle. Then he whispered, his voice soft but clear enough for me to hear, "I have waited for this opportunity for a long time." I was horrified, unable to believe what I had just heard. My mind was spinning, trying to comprehend what was happening, but everything seemed to fall apart at that moment. The worries and doubts from before suddenly became too real, and I realized that the nightmare I had thought was just an imagination had become a reality. A smile appeared on Mark's face as he sat down next to me, and his eyes were filled with calculation. The ominous I lay there helpless, unable to move or resist, only able to listen to his every word. Each sentence echoed clearly, gradually revealing a horrifying truth that I had never considered. He began to explain that ever since I entered college, he had feelings for me and had always wanted to get close to me. He had tried every opportunity to approach me but noticed that I always kept my distance and did not let him in. His attempts to connect failed, and my avoidance made him choose another path to infiltrate my life. Mark began to learn about me, delving into my personal information and background. When he learned about my mother and our family situation, he decided that the only way to get close to me was through her. He planned to get to know my mother, gradually earning her trust. Everything seemed to happen easily for him, and before I knew it, he had become my mother's husband, integrating himself into my family life. Hearing those explanations made me feel as if I was falling into a deep pit of despair. I could not believe that everything that had happened around me was so meticulously orchestrated. What I had thought was normal, my mother's happiness, turned out to be just a facade with the ultimate goal of getting close to me. After I realized that everything from the beginning to the end was a part of his plan, I felt an overwhelming sense of pain and hatred. Mark walked closer to me after he stopped speaking, and his eyes filled with joy as he saw me lying immobile on the bed. His eyes were greedy and cold, and I was powerless as he approached. My mother had seen them be gentle. I made an effort to shrink back, but I was unable to do so. Despite my racing heart, my body felt like it was no longer obeying me. Then, Mark leaned down and passed his hands over me, bringing with them a feeling of disgust that I was unable to shake. He took control of my body without mercy. I could only lie there paralyzed, feeling that every moment he took away from me stretched out like eternity, and all I could do was hope that it would eventually come to an end. However, he did not stop the world around me from collapsing. I wanted to struggle to fight back, but it was all in vain because Mark didn't stop, and my body no longer belonged to me. He took away all of the people I had known. I wanted to fight back. It appeared as though time would never end. Every passing second is turning into a nightmare from which there is no escape. I lay there helpless, staring at the ceiling, attempting to escape reality, but everything kept unfolding slowly and painfully. The paralysis from losing control intensified my fear with every passing second and minute. Every move he made, every touch was like a blow to my self-esteem and dignity. I felt as if my body no longer belonged to me. I was completely taken over by him. Everything occurred so slowly that I could only lie there, living in terror with no ability to fight back. Pieces of me broke without any means to stop it. I felt as though my body no longer belonged to me. When it was over, I lay there feeling empty and numb. When it ended, the room felt cold, stuffy, and lifeless, and I lay there feeling empty and numb. Oh, and I wanted it to end. As I lay there, helpless to escape the horror that I had just experienced, I felt my entire world crumble down around me. Mark stood up and adjusted his clothes as if nothing had occurred. All of the things that I had known and believed in gradually lost their significance. The thoughts that were running through my head were filled with reverberating questions that were loaded with anguish and rage. I was unable to comprehend why it had occurred. How could the person whom my mother loved and whom I had attempted to accept as a member of my family do something horrible to me? The jumbled anguish, fear, and betrayal suffocated me, leaving me with nothing but helplessness and despair. Mark glanced at me one last time, his eyes cold and remorseless, then left the room, leaving me with all the hurt, the torment, and the growing obsession in my mind. I didn't know how to face this reality or how to continue living when everything seemed to have completely collapsed after a while. As the effects of the drug gradually wore off, I felt control slowly returning to my body, still weak and dizzy. I tried to stand up. Every movement was painful, but I knew what I had to do next. My hands shook as I tried to straighten my clothes, attempting to hide the traces of the horror I had just experienced. I looked around the room, my eyes stopping at the phone on the table. It was my only way to call for help to end this nightmare with unsteady steps. I approached with my hands and was still trembling as I picked up the phone. I dialed 911, each number feeling more challenging, and when the operator's voice came through, I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady and let it all out. The police arrived in seconds, but to me the wait felt like an eternity. When they entered the house, the silence shattered. Voices rang out, footsteps hurried, and finally Mark was arrested. He didn't resist, just bowed his head silently as the police handcuffed him as if he knew it was over. Following my mother's return, which occurred not long after the police had arrested Mark, she observed me standing close to the police while I continued to shake and feel weak. At first she didn't understand what was happening. I looked into my mother's eyes, and all my strength seemed to evaporate in that moment. I couldn't hold back any longer. Tears streamed down my face as I told her everything. My voice broke as I recounted the truth about Mark, what he had done, and the horror I had endured. My mother was stunned. Her eyes wide with confusion and pain. She didn't say anything the whole time. She just stood there, as if her whole world had collapsed. When I finished, my mother collapsed, sobbing in utter grief and regret. She blamed herself for not realizing what was wrong and for bringing someone like Mark into our lives. In her pain, she repeated one sentence over and over, I'm sorry, but I knew that no apology could ever erase the pain we were feeling that day. Changed everything forever. My mother could never forgive herself, and I could never return to the way my life was before. After the police arrested Mark, a part of me felt relief, but the pain and hurt did not fade immediately. I had achieved justice for myself. I had bravely faced what he had done, but that did not mean the haunting would disappear. My mother, after hearing the whole truth, sank into a deep state of regret. She couldn't stop blaming herself for letting Mark into our lives, and for not recognizing his true nature. She decided to leave the house we shared and closed the boutique for a while, to find peace of mind. When the police found Mark guilty, I knew I would never see him again. However, this was not enough to mend the wounds in my heart. He had damaged a portion of my life, and regardless of how much time had passed, the agony remained like a scar that would never heal from the awful events that had occurred. In my experience, I have realized that the only way to obtain mental tranquility is to fearlessly confront the truth, regardless of how unpleasant it may be. Silence is never the solution to distress or anxiety. Silence and concealment will only serve to prolong the suffering and eat away at you. Even though my mother was unaware of what had happened, the faith she had in Mark and in me resulted in unanticipated consequences. If I had had the guts to speak out when I realized something was wrong with Mark, maybe things would not have escalated to this point, except for Mark's punishment and my mother's acknowledgement of her mistake. If I had the courage to voice my concerns when I discovered something was wrong with Mark, it was really important. Our lives did not return to normal. I had to learn to live with the pain of the hauntings of the past and find peace from wounds that are difficult to heal. As for my mother, she also has to learn to forgive herself. Everything is still ongoing, and I cannot be sure what will happen in the future. But one thing I know for sure: I will not be silent anymore. I will continue to move forward, no matter how difficult the road is. The regret and pain will still follow me, but I know that I have begun my journey of healing. Although the road is long and difficult, I will no longer be a victim of silence. I will find myself again and reclaim the strength that I lost in that nightmare.